Spring, 1221. Dust chokes the air over the jagged valleys of Parwan, north of Kabul, where the Hindu Kush mountains claw at the sky. A Mongol horde, 30,000 strong, charges into the fray, their arrows blotting out the sun like a swarm of death. But today, the invincible falter. Jalal al-Din Khwarazmshah, the last defiant sultan of a crumbling empire, unleashes his 60,000 warriors, Persians, Turks, Afghans forged in desperation. Blades clash in a frenzy, horses scream as they're gutted, and the ground turns to mud with blood. For the first time, Genghis Khan's machine of conquest shatters, bodies piling in heaps that will haunt the steppes forever. Thousands fall, the Mongols reeling back in disbelief, their myth of invincibility cracked open like a fragile skull. This fracture in history's armor draws us in, a whisper from the graves of the forgotten. If the weight of such shadows pulls at you, linger with brooding history. Subscribe to uncover what lies deeper, like this revelation if it grips your soul. Share it with those who seek the unseen, and comment your thoughts on the turning tides of fate. The storm had been brewing for years. By 1219, Genghis Khan, the tempest from the Mongolian plains, had turned his gaze westward. The Khwarezmian Empire, sprawling from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River, stood as a glittering prize, rich in silk roads, towering minarets, and ancient Persian wisdom. But its Shah, Muhammad II, sealed his doom with arrogance. When Mongol envoys arrived in Otrar seeking trade, the governor slaughtered them, igniting a fire that would consume nations. Genghis, ever the strategist, swore vengeance. His armies, disciplined nomads hardened by endless winters, swept in like a plague. Cities fell. Bukhara burned, its scholars thrown into rivers. Samarkand's walls crumbled under siege engines. Urgench was razed, its people drowned in diverted waters. The Shah fled, dying broken on an island in the Caspian, leaving his son Jalal al-Din to inherit a throne of ashes. Jalal al-Din was no coward. 24 years old, with the fire of Persian kings in his veins, he rallied what remained. Guerrilla strikes from the shadows, ambushes in mountain passes. He became a ghost, haunting the invaders. But Genghis, sensing the threat, dispatched his adopted son, Shigi Kutuk, with a force of 30,000 to crush this upstart. Shigi, a brilliant tactician, had never tasted defeat. His men were the elite, horse archers who could loose arrows at full gallop, infantry clad in leather and silk that turned blades. They marched into Parwan expecting another rout, underestimating the desperation fueling Jalal's ranks. The terrain favored the hunted. Parwan's valleys, etched by rivers and flanked by steep ridges, neutralized the Mongols' famed mobility. Jalal's army, swollen to 60,000 by refugees and mercenaries, included heavy cavalry from Persian nobility and foot soldiers from Afghan tribes, men who fought not for glory, but survival. Social hierarchies frayed here. Princes stood shoulder to shoulder with peasants, united by the shared terror of annihilation. Belief systems clashed too. The Khwarezmians, steeped in Islamic fervor, saw this as jihad against pagan hordes, while the Mongols bowed to the eternal blue sky, their shamans invoking spirits for victory. As the armies converged, psychological undercurrents simmered. Jalal motivated his troops with tales of Mongol atrocities. Women violated, children skewered, entire lineages erased. Whispers spread of Genghis's wrath, a man who claimed divine mandate yet ruled through fear. Shigi, confident in numbers and discipline, positioned his forces on open ground, ready to encircle and destroy. But Jalal had a plan, born of cunning and necessity. He divided his men into contingents, using the hills for cover, archers perched like vultures. The battle erupted at dawn. Mongol scouts probed, met by a hail of arrows from hidden positions. Short, brutal skirmishes escalated into chaos. A Khwarezmian flank feigned retreat, luring Shigi's center into a trap. Then, the countercharge. Jalal's cavalry thundered down, smashing through lines with lances and scimitars. Men hacked at each other in the crush, limbs severed, faces mangled. By midday the Mongols wavered, their formations breaking under relentless pressure. Shigi ordered a rally, but panic seeped in, unfamiliar, poisonous. What broke the unbreakable? Was it the sheer weight of numbers, or something deeper in the human spirit, a refusal to vanish into history's void? The day wore on, casualties mounting, the air thick with the metallic tang of slaughter. As evening shadows lengthened, the Mongols began to fracture, retreating in disarray for the first time under Genghis's banner. But victory's taste was fleeting. Word would reach the great Khan, and his fury would know no bounds. What retribution awaited in the valleys beyond? The retreat began as a trickle, then became a flood. Mongol horsemen, once masters of the feigned withdrawal, now fled in genuine terror, their banners trampled under hooves. Shigi Kutuk, the adopted son of Genghis, the man who had never lost, watched his formations dissolve. Over half his army, perhaps 15,000 souls, lay dead or captured on that narrow, unforgiving ground. Prisoners were not spared mercy. Stakes driven into ears, screams echoing off the rocks as the victors exacted a grim toll for years of terror. Jalal al-Din, bloodied but unbroken, rode among his men, his presence a fire that kept the exhausted ranks from collapsing. For one fleeting day, the unstoppable horde had been stopped. The myth cracked. Word raced across mountains and valleys like wildfire. The Mongols could bleed. Yet victory carried its own poison. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the coalition fractured. A dispute erupted over spoils. A single, white horse, symbol of prestige among the tribes. Amin Malik, father-in-law to Jalal, struck Saif al-Din Iraq in rage. The Sultan, seeking to preserve fragile unity, refused to punish the offense. That night, under cover of darkness, the Afghans and Khalaj slipped away. Campfires burned unattended as thousands deserted, their loyalty dissolved in resentment and exhaustion. By dawn, Jalal's force, swollen to perhaps 70,000 at its peak, had shrunk to 30,000 weary survivors. The triumph at Parwan, so hard won, began to unravel almost before the blood dried. Genghis Khan, encamped far to the north at Talikan, received the news like a thunderclap. He rode to the battlefield himself, walking among the fallen, his face carved from stone. To Shigi Kutuk, he spoke words that cut deeper than any blade. You did not know the place of battle, and you were both at fault. No rage exploded outward, not yet. Instead, the great Khan turned inward, analyzing, recalculating. He had lost battles before in his youth, but never like this, not since he forged his empire. The defeat stung, yet it sharpened his resolve. Rebellions ignited in the wake. Merv rose under Kush Tegin Pahlawan, seizing the city. Bukhara followed. Herat stirred. Cities that had bowed in surrender now bared their teeth, inspired by the ghost of Parwan. Genghis dispatched forces to crush them, but the illusion of invincibility had shattered. For the first time, men dared to hope the storm could be weathered. Jalal al-Din knew the respite was temporary. He marched south to Ghazni, consolidating what remained, distributing captured Mongol armor as trophies, reminding his men of the impossible they had achieved. Yet the desertions haunted him. His army, once a roaring tide of Persians, Turks, and mountain tribesmen, now felt fragile, held together by will alone. The Sultan understood the deeper truth. Parwan was not an end, but a delay. Genghis would come. The Khan's vengeance was patient, methodical, inevitable. Jalal sent scouts eastward, probing routes toward the Indus, the great river that marked the edge of the known world. India lay beyond, perhaps sanctuary, perhaps another battlefield. The psychological weight pressed heavier than any armor. Jalal's men had tasted victory, but they had also tasted the fragility of alliances. Tribal rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Old grudges flared in quiet moments. The Sultan himself carried the burden of legacy. Son of a fallen empire, last hope of a dynasty reduced to ash. Every decision now echoed with the ghosts of Bukhara's burning libraries, Samarkand's mass graves, the rivers choked with bodies. He fought not just for survival, but to prove that Persian civilization, ancient and proud, could endure the apocalypse. As autumn winds swept the Hindu Kush, scouts returned with grim tidings. Mongol banners moved south in force. Genghis himself advanced, reinforced by his sons, a host that dwarfed anything Parwan had seen. The passes narrowed, the terrain grew harsher, yet the enemy closed relentlessly. Jalal al-Din faced a choice that has haunted commanders across centuries: stand and fight a superior foe on ground of his choosing, or retreat, preserving his force for another day. The Indus beckoned, a line of escape and peril. What drives a man to keep fighting when the tide turns against him? When allies betray, when numbers fail, when the greatest conqueror in history hunts you personally? Jalal's answer lay in the ruins of his father's empire, in the faces of men who had followed him through fire. But the clock ticked. The Khan drew nearer. The next confrontation would decide whether Parwan's spark became legend, or flickered out forever in blood. The Indus River gleamed silver under a merciless sun as Jalal al-Din's diminished army reached its banks near the town of Kalich, November 1221. Dust still clung to their armor, the stink of old blood and horse sweat heavy in the air. Behind them, the Mongol pursuit had become a shadow that never lifted, Genghis himself leading the main host, his sons Jebe and Subutai sweeping the flanks, silent as wolves circling wounded prey. 30,000 Mongols, perhaps more, closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. Jalal had no illusions left. Parwan had bought time, not salvation. Now the river, wide and fast, offered the only path: cross or die. He chose the crossing point with care. The ford at Kalich was shallow enough for men and horses, treacherous enough to slow an enemy charge. On the near bank, Jalal arrayed his remaining force, perhaps 25,000, the elite of what survived, into 3 lines. Heavy Persian cavalry anchored the center, Afghan infantry and Turkic archers on the wings. Every man understood the arithmetic. They could not win. They could only delay, bleed the enemy, give the Sultan and his household time to escape. It was a sacrifice dressed as strategy. The Mongols arrived at midday. Genghis halted on a low ridge, surveying the scene with the cold appraisal of a man who had already counted the dead. No grand speeches, no ritual displays. He simply raised his hand. The first wave of horse archers surged forward, loosing volleys that darkened the sky. Arrows thudded into shields, pierced mail, found throats. Jalal's men answered with disciplined return fire, their composite bows, shorter, heavier than the Mongol ones, effective at close range. Bodies began to pile at the water's edge. Horses reared, screaming as shafts found their eyes. Then the Mongols shifted tactics. They feigned retreat, the classic lure that had broken countless armies before. Jalal's men held. They had learned at Parwan what happened when you chased shadows. The Khan tried again, another feint, another withdrawal. Still the Khwarezmians stood firm, shields locked, spears bristling. Frustration crept into the Mongol ranks. Genghis signaled the heavy assault. Armored lancers, followed by infantry carrying scaling ladders and siege hooks, pressed toward the ford. The river churned red as men on both sides hacked at each other in the shallows. Water turned to froth and crimson foam. A Persian noble, his horse shot from under him, fought on foot until 3 Mongol blades found his chest. Nearby, an Afghan tribesman dragged a wounded comrade to safety, only to be cut down moments later. The pressure mounted hour after hour. Jalal moved through the lines, his voice steady, his sword red to the hilt. He killed in person, leading countercharges that threw the Mongols back into the current. For brief moments, the line held. But numbers told their own story. Mongol reinforcements poured in, fresh horses, fresh arrows, fresh men who had not yet tasted exhaustion. Jalal's soldiers fought with the grim fury of those who know the end is near. They sang verses from the Quran, they cursed in Persian and Pashto, they died standing. As the sun began its descent, the center buckled. A Mongol wedge drove through, splitting the formation. Jalal's household guard, his most loyal, formed a ring around him. The Sultan looked across the river. On the far bank, his family waited, his mother, his wives, his young son. Escape was still possible. One last decision remained. He turned to his men. In a voice that carried over the din, he spoke of duty, of honor, of the empire that would live so long as one of them breathed. Then he ordered the retreat, not flight, controlled withdrawal. The rearguard would hold the ford while the main body crossed. It was the hardest order he ever gave. Those who stayed knew they would not see another sunrise. The crossing became chaos. Horses slipped on wet stones, men drowned under the weight of armor, arrows continued to fall like rain. Jalal reached the far bank last, turning once to look back. The rearguard fought on, a thin line of steel and will against the tide. Their silhouettes darkened against the sunset as Mongol lancers rode them down. The river swallowed their screams. On the eastern shore, Jalal gathered what remained, perhaps a few thousand, many wounded, most without mounts. The Indus had become a grave for thousands of his best. Genghis, victorious but bloodied, did not pursue immediately. The Khan knew the cost of this day. He had won, yet the price had been higher than any previous victory. Parwan's echo lingered even in triumph. Jalal al-Din rode into the Punjab night, a fugitive king with a shattered army and an unbroken spirit. Behind him lay the ruins of an empire. Ahead lay unknown lands, uncertain alliances, and the relentless shadow of the man who had sworn to erase his name from history. But one question burned brighter than the rest. Could a single man, hunted across continents, still defy the greatest conqueror the world had ever known? Or had the Indus crossing marked the true, final end of the Khwarezmian dream? The Punjab night swallowed Jalal al-Din and the remnants of his army like a dark tide. November 1221 bled into winter. They rode east through thorn-choked plains and shallow riverbeds, horses stumbling from exhaustion, men swaying in saddles with wounds that festered under filthy bandages. Behind them, the Indus still carried the bodies of the rear guard downstream, silent witnesses to the price of delay. Ahead lay the unknown, the domains of the Delhi Sultanate, fragile and newly born under Iltutmish, a former slave who had seized power through cunning and steel. Jalal sent envoys ahead, pleading for sanctuary, for alliance against the common enemy. The responses came slowly, polite, evasive, cold. No king welcomes a fugitive whose very presence invites annihilation. Genghis Khan did not cross the river in immediate pursuit. He had tasted enough blood for one campaign. Instead, he turned north, securing the conquered lands, crushing the rebellions that Parwan had inspired. Merv was retaken in a storm of arrows and fire. Herat's gates opened again under threat of total destruction. The great Khan's wrath was surgical now. Cities that had dared rise were leveled, their populations scattered or enslaved. Yet his gaze never fully left the east. Scouts reported Jalal's movements, his small band growing thinner with every league. Genghis knew the value of patience. A wounded animal runs until it drops. Jalal al-Din refused to drop. In the winter of 1231-1222, he carved out a precarious existence in the Punjab hills. He raided Mongol outposts, ambushed supply trains, struck and vanished before retaliation could arrive. His name became a talisman among the local tribes, Rajputs, Jats, hill clans, who had watched the Khwarezmian collapse with wary respect. Some joined him. A few hundred here, a few score there. Not enough to rebuild an army, but enough to keep the flame alive. He married into local nobility, binding fragile alliances with blood and promises. His mother, Turkan Khatun, once the formidable power behind the Khwarezmian throne, now rode at his side, her face lined with grief and iron resolve. His young son, still a child, learned the saddle before he learned peace. Yet the psychological toll deepened. Every raid reminded his men of what they had lost. They fought with the fury of the dispossessed, but they also fought with the weariness of the hunted. Sleep came in snatches, haunted by dreams of burning cities, drowned rivers, the faces of comrades left at the Indus ford. Jalal himself grew thinner, his eyes darker, his laughter rarer. He spoke often of destiny, of how the wheel of fortune turns, how empires rise and fall, how one man's will could still bend history. His followers listened, but doubt crept in during the long nights. Was this defiance, or merely prolonged dying? By spring 1222, the net began to tighten again. Mongol detachments, under commanders who had learned from Parwan, pushed deeper into the Punjab. They moved in small, mobile columns, never committing the full host, never giving Jalal the chance for another pitched battle. They burned villages that sheltered him, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock. The land itself turned hostile. Famine followed in their wake. Jalal's band shrank further, desertions, disease, skirmishes that claimed more than they gained. He decided to strike north, toward the mountains of Kashmir, seeking defensible ground and new recruits among the fierce hill tribes. The march was brutal. Snow still clung to the high passes, men and horses slipped on ice, fell into ravines, froze where they lay. Yet Jalal pressed on. In the narrow valleys near the Jhelum River, he turned once more to face his pursuers. A Mongol vanguard, perhaps 3,000 strong, caught up with him in a steep-sided gorge. The ground was too broken for cavalry charges, the air thin and cold. Jalal's men used the terrain like a weapon, rolling boulders, arrows from hidden ledges, sudden rushes down the slopes. The engagement was short, savage, and indecisive. The Mongols withdrew, bloodied but intact. Jalal could claim no victory, only survival, yet the cost mounted. His mother, weakened by the winter march, fell ill. She died in a makeshift camp under a pine tree, her last words a curse upon the invaders and a plea for her son to endure. Jalal buried her with his own hands, the earth frozen hard, the grave unmarked. Something in him hardened that day. Grief turned inward, becoming a cold, unyielding core. Word of these raids reached Delhi. Iltutmish, ever cautious, saw opportunity and danger in equal measure. A letter arrived. Asylum would be granted, but only if Jalal disbanded his force and came alone, as a guest, not a rival claimant. The Sultan feared the magnetic pull of a man who had defied Genghis. Jalal read the offer in silence. To accept meant safety, but also the end of resistance. To refuse meant certain death, sooner or later. The choice hung over him like a blade. He gathered his remaining captains under starlight, the firelight carving hollows in their faces. They spoke little, each knew the arithmetic had not changed. Behind them stood the greatest conqueror alive. Ahead lay only the slow grind of attrition. In that moment of quiet, as embers died and the mountain wind rose, Jalal al-Din made his decision. He would not bend. He would not fade. He would carry the fight forward, deeper into the unknown, across borders no army had crossed, until either he or his enemy broke. But how far can one man run before the shadow overtakes him? And what remains when the last ally turns away, the last hope of alliance dies, and the world itself seems to conspire with the hunter? The years 1222 to 1224 became a grim twilight in the Punjab and Sindh. Jalal al-Din, now a shadow king with a shrinking band of loyalists, turned raider. He struck at local rulers, Nasir al-Din Kabacha in Uchch, the masters of Lahore's fringes, plundering villages, seizing grain stores, extracting tribute from terrified chieftains. His men, hardened by endless flight, moved like ghosts through the heat-shimmering plains. They took what they needed, burned what resisted, then vanished into the hills before larger forces could respond. The Punjab, already scarred by earlier invasions, felt the sting of a desperate man clinging to power. He captured swaths of territory, held Lahore for fleeting months, but never built anything lasting. Alliances dissolved as quickly as they formed. Local lords saw in him not a savior, but a storm that would pass. Iltutmish, the shrewd sultan of Delhi, watched from afar. Envoys came and went, Jalal pleading for joint resistance against the Mongols, offering marriage ties, promising shared glory. Iltutmish refused every overture. He understood the calculus. Sheltering the fugitive would draw Genghis's wrath southward, and Delhi's walls, however strong, had not been tested against such a horde. Better to let the wolf bleed out in the wilderness. When Mongol scouts probed too close, Iltutmish marched north in force, not to aid, but to expel. Jalal retreated deeper into Sindh and northern Gujarat, his raids growing more savage, more futile. The land suffered, crops trampled, wells poisoned in retreat. Populations fleeing the path of this last Khwarezmian flame. By late 1223, or early 1224, the pressure became unbearable. Mongol detachments under Dorbe Dokshin harried his camps, besieging him for 40 days in one grueling spring before the scorching heat forced withdrawal. Jalal's brother, Ghiyath al-Din Pirsha, holding fragile footholds in western Persia, sent urgent messages. Return, rally what remains, rebuild in the old heartlands. The call pulled like gravity. Jalal left a lieutenant to hold the Punjab scraps, soon lost, and marched west across the arid Makran coast. The journey was hell. Water scarce, heat relentless, men dropping from thirst and exhaustion. Yet he pressed on, driven by the dream of restoration. Persia awaited, fractured, bleeding, but still Persian. He entered Iran like a returning storm. In 1224, he confirmed local governors, extracted submission from his half-brother in Hamadan and Isfahan, married into the Salgurid line in Fars for legitimacy. Clashes erupted with the Abbasid Caliph al-Nasir in Khuzestan. Jalal seized territories, proclaiming himself the rightful Khwarezm Shah reborn. By 1225, he established a court in Tabriz, gathering mercenaries, remnants of old armies, anyone willing to fight under his banner. The Mongol presence lingered, small garrisons, watchful scouts, but Genghis had returned to Mongolia, leaving the west to subordinates. Jalal moved aggressively, reducing the Ismailis of Alamut to tribute, striking into Azerbaijan, even pushing toward Georgia. The Georgians, under Queen Rusudan, mocked his overtures. Letters flew, Jalal demanding submission, Rusudan reminding him of the Indus humiliation. Insult met insult. In 1225 he invaded, capturing Tbilisi in a brutal sack. The city burned, churches looted, inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. Yet victory proved hollow. Rebellions flared in his rear, local rulers chafed under his heavy hand. He lacked the political skill to weld his conquests into something enduring. Tribal feuds reignited, old grudges resurfaced, and Mongol reinforcements began arriving under new commanders like Chorma Khan. The psychological strain showed in every decision. Jalal fought with the fury of a man who had seen his world erased, yet he ruled like one who knew the end drew near. His followers whispered of destiny, of how Parwan had proven the Mongols mortal, how the Indus escape had marked divine favor. But doubt crept in. Every raid, every battle cost more than it gained. Allies turned to enemies. Brothers plotted. The caliph's forces harassed his flanks. By 1230, the tide turned decisively. Chorma Khan's Mongols swept into northern Persia, relentless and well-supplied. Jalal met them near Isfahan, two armies clashing in dust and blood. The Mongols won a Pyrrhic victory, their lines shattered, but Jalal could not press the advantage. His forces, exhausted and divided, melted away. That same year his brother Ghiyath rebelled openly, only to be crushed and killed alongside their mother. The family curse completed itself. Jalal fled west, through Akhlat, Amid, Mayafarkin pursued without mercy. He sought recruits, alliances, anything to stem the collapse. None came. The man who had defied Genghis now ran as a fugitive once more, his empire reduced to the space between his horse's hooves. In the summer of 1231, cornered in Diyarbakir's rugged hills, he sought shelter among Kurdish villagers. What happened next remains shadowed. Some say betrayal for gold, others revenge for past atrocities. A blade found him in the night. The last Khwarezm Shah died alone, far from the rivers and cities he had fought to reclaim. His death marked the final extinguishing of a dynasty. Yet the question lingers, heavy as mountain stone. Did his relentless defiance inspire future resistance against the Mongol tide? Or did it merely prolong the inevitable agony of a world already broken? The death of Jalal al-Din in August 1231 did not end the story. It only changed its shape. In the mountain village near Diyarbakir, where Kurdish hands delivered the final stroke, the last Khwarezm Shah fell without ceremony. No golden shroud, no grand tomb, only a shallow grave hastily covered before the Mongol vanguard arrived. His head was taken as proof, paraded before Chorma Khan, then lost to history. The body, stripped and abandoned, became carrion for the crows that circled the high valleys. A dynasty that had ruled from the Aral Sea to the gates of India vanished in a single night of betrayal and steel. Yet the silence that followed carried its own weight. Men who had ridden with him, scattered now across Persia, India, the Caucasus, whispered his name in the years that came after. Not always with reverence, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with something closer to awe. The Mongol Empire rolled onward, unstoppable in appearance. Chorma Khan subdued Azerbaijan and Georgia, reducing once proud kingdoms to tributary states. Subutai and Batu swept into Russia, crushing the principalities one after another. Hulagu would later sack Baghdad in 1258, drowning the Abbasid Caliphate in blood and ink. The world Genghis had dreamed of, united under one sky, one law, seemed within reach. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had formed long before. Parwan was the first visible fracture. The Indus crossing the second. Jalal al-Din's decade-long defiance, though it ended in failure, had demonstrated something dangerous. The Mongols could be resisted. Not easily, not cleanly, but they could be made to pay in blood, time, and pride. In the decades that followed, that lesson spread like slow poison. Local rulers in Persia learned to delay tribute, to fortify mountain passes, to harass supply lines with small, elusive bands. The Ismailis of Alamut, whom Jalal had once humbled, turned their own mountain strongholds into death traps for Mongol columns. When Hulagu finally destroyed them in 1256, he did so at enormous cost. Years of siege, thousands of lives, and the knowledge that even impregnable fortresses could fall only after bleeding the besiegers dry. The pattern repeated across the Ilkhanate. Rebellions, small and large, uprisings in Khorasan, tax revolts in Fars, guerrilla warfare in the Zagros. None toppled the Mongols outright. But each reminded the conquerors that rule over such vast, diverse lands required more than arrows and terror. It required compromise, conversion, eventually assimilation. Jalal's shadow fell longest over the Delhi Sultanate. Iltutmish had refused him sanctuary, yet the memory of a man who had faced Genghis and lived to fight another day lingered in the minds of Indian commanders. When Ogeday's successor sent expeditions southward in the 1240s and 1250s, they met resistance far fiercer than expected. The sultans of Delhi, Balban, Alauddin, built fortified cities, raised massive standing armies, and adopted the very tactics Jalal had used in the Punjab. Hit-and-run raids, scorched earth, refusal to meet the enemy in open battle. Alauddin Khalji's victories at Kili in 1299 and Amroha in 1305 were not accidents. They were the distant grandchildren of Parwan. Proof that disciplined defense, intelligent use of terrain, and sheer refusal to yield could blunt even the Mongol storm. Across the centuries, the name Jalal al-Din faded into chronicles, then into legend. Persian poets mourned him as the last flower of an ancient tree. Mongol historians dismissed him as a troublesome insect. Yet the truth lies somewhere between. He was neither savior nor fool. He was a man who, when everything had been stripped away, empire, family, army, hope, chose to keep fighting. Not for victory, which became impossible after the Indus. Not for restoration, which slipped further out of reach with every passing year. He fought because surrender would have erased the one thing the Mongols could never take, the knowledge that they were not gods. The long-term scars remain visible even now. The demographic collapse of Central Asia and Persia after the invasions, cities depopulated, irrigation systems destroyed, libraries burned, took generations to heal. The cultural memory of trauma shaped societies for centuries, yet so did the memory of resistance. When Timur rose in the late 14th century, claiming descent from Genghis, yet styling himself protector of Islam, he drew on the same wells of defiance Jalal had tapped. When the Safavids unified Iran in the 16th century, they invoked the old Persian pride that had refused to vanish under Mongol hooves. The wheel turns, empires rise, empires fall. But the question that Jalal al-Din carried into every battle, every retreat, every lonely night on the run still echoes across time. When the greatest power the world had ever known comes for you, when the sky itself seems to fight against you, what is the value of one man's refusal to kneel? And perhaps the deeper, darker answer lies not in victory or defeat, but in the simple, stubborn fact that he never did. The grave of Jalal al-Din Khwarazm Shah lies somewhere in the rugged hills near Silvan, lost to time and the indifference of centuries. No marker remains, no inscription, only wind moving through dry grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The man who defied the greatest conqueror the world had ever known slipped into silence as quietly as he had once ridden out of burning cities. His name faded from the lips of kings, survived only in scattered chronicles, in the half-remembered songs of Persian poets, in the guarded stories told around campfires in the Punjab and the valleys of the Hindu Kush. Yet something endured. Not monuments, not empires. A quiet, stubborn idea that even against overwhelming power, refusal has meaning. Parwan was the proof, 60,000 against 30,000, desperation against discipline, and for one day the invincible bled and broke. The Indus crossing was the cost, thousands left behind in the red water, a rearguard that chose death over flight so their sultan might live another season. The long years of raid and flight, alliance and betrayal, the final knife in the dark, all of it traced back to that first crack in the Mongol myth. One man had shown the world that the storm could be wounded. Others watched. And in watching, they learned. The Mongol Empire itself began to change because of men like him. The Ilkhanate in Persia adopted Islam within a generation. The Yuan in China absorbed Confucian bureaucracy. The Golden Horde blended with the steppes it ruled. Conquest, it turned out, was easier than governing. The very vastness that made the Mongols unstoppable also made them vulnerable. They needed local knowledge, local loyalty, local compromise. Jalal al-Din never forced those concessions. He simply refused to vanish. His persistence, futile in the moment, planted seeds of doubt that grew slowly over decades. When later invaders came, Timur, Babur, even the Mughals, they carried echoes of his defiance, claiming legitimacy through resistance as much as through bloodlines. In the modern age, the story resonates differently. Across Central Asia and the Middle East, where borders still bear the scars of 13th century devastation, Jalal al-Din is remembered not as a failed king, but as the last free sovereign before the long night of subjugation. In Afghanistan, where Parwan province still carries the name, oral traditions speak of the day the Mongols ran. In Iran, he is invoked as a symbol of unyielding Persian identity. Even in India, where the Delhi Sultanate turned away the fugitive, military academies study his guerrilla campaigns as early models of asymmetric warfare against superior force. The darkness he fought never truly lifted. Empires rise on ruin, cities are rebuilt on ash, rivers run clear again over bones long forgotten. But the human cost lingers in subtler ways, in the mistrust between mountain tribes and lowland rulers, in the fortified passes that still dot the landscape, in the instinctive wariness toward strangers who arrive with overwhelming power. History does not heal cleanly. It scars. And yet, in that scarring, there is something unbreakable. Jalal al-Din did not save his empire. He did not halt the Mongol tide. He did not live to see old age or peace. But he did something rarer. He forced the greatest conqueror alive to feel the sting of doubt, if only for a moment. He made the sky seem a little less certain. And in doing so, he reminded every generation since that no power, however vast, however merciless, is ever truly absolute. The past whispers warnings. Stay connected with brooding history. Subscribe now if these shadows still linger in your mind, like this tale if it unsettled you. Share the darkness with those who seek truth, and leave your thoughts below. What would you have done, standing on that final riverbank with the greatest storm in history at your back? Speak. The graves are listening.